In the previous episode, we met Diane Bass, one of the preeminent Orange County defense attorneys who specializes in helping people get the best possible outcome. And she spoke with us about somebody charged with a $50 million fraud sentence. Well, I'm going to let her tell you the sentence. Diane, what, first of all, is an EB5 fraud, which you spoke about in the last episode?
So it's an immigration case. And there is a rule in the immigration context where if somebody is in another country and they invest at least $500,000 into a business in the United States and they create at least 10 jobs for people in the United States, then they can get a visa, which is called an EB5 visa, so that they can come and live in the United States.
And so $500,000, the upside for the individual who makes the investment is they get to come to America and build their dream and live the American dream. And what does the entrepreneur do to take advantage of this program for good and, forget illicit purposes? What is the entrepreneur trying to accomplish?
The entrepreneur who is investing in the EB5 visa program?
The flip side, the one that makes it available and says, I want to take this money and what am I going to do? I'm going to create jobs?
They're going to create a community center. So they're employing all sorts of people to work in the community center, but in the development process, they're purchasing real estate. They're hiring architects, designers, planners. They're going through all of these different processes, getting permits. So there's a lot of work that goes into building out these community centers. And then when the immigrant or the person coming in from another country comes to the country, they have this whole thing set up for them when they arrive.
So in theory, somebody who's putting up the $500,000 is really benefiting the United States. And so the United States reciprocates by giving them, first of all, a green card potentially, and then a pathway to citizenship. Is that right?
Yes.
In this case, what happened? Why was there an allegation of fraud?
So what happened was there was a gentleman overseas who was taking money from these investors, and we're just going to call them investors. And they all understood that the requirement for the United States process was $500,000. But many of them were promised a refund before they came to the United States, which violates the rules of the immigration process. So they would initially deposit $500,000 in this person's account, and then that person would pay them back half of the money, and that's how he sold the program. Meanwhile, this person had a daughter in the United States who he encouraged, and that's a very gentle way of saying it, his daughter to go to law school and become an immigration lawyer so she can handle the paperwork. And he would send all of the documents pre-signed by his clients overseas to his daughter, and she would put them through the immigration process. She was also the one that was handling the purchasing of real estate, hiring people to build out these programs, etc.
And was there anything wrong with what they were doing, what you described right there, or is that consistent with what the EB5 program is supposed to do?
What was wrong with it was that they were giving the refunds to these people. So some of these people were not victims, they were complicit in the process. And the government, the U.S. attorney who worked on the case and the judge who worked on the case completely understood that.
But to make that understanding possible, because a lot of times prosecutors will look at a case like this with very cynical eyes. And even though this person played although she was a lawyer, was a ministerial role, right? She was just an admin handling her father's paperwork. She wasn't a ringleader, so to speak.
Correct.
She was doing the will of her father. And yet, in many cases, prosecutors will say, well, this person either knew or should have known or was willfully blind, and they will want to extract their pound of flesh. How were you so successful in getting the prosecutor to see it from a more pragmatic or realistic approach?
So the way she came to me, as I said in our last video, is you referred her to me. She had been working with an attorney in LA who told her, let's just wait, which is the absolute worst advice she possibly could have received. This lawyer obviously doesn't do a lot of federal criminal cases. And she was just saying, based on the lawyer's compassion for this person, this individual, she said, we'll just go to trial and we'll win. But that was not realistic. So you referred her to me. She came to me and you wrote her narrative. And it was an unbelievably tragic story. Her entire life from the moment she was born until the moment she was arrested is heart-wrenching. And one of the reasons that she engaged in the conduct is because she is Chinese. Chinese daughters are extremely obedient to their children. There is actually something called filial piety, and you can Google it and you can find article upon article, which I did, which I presented to the judge at sentencing. But prior to that, you were able to somehow extract her story from her, which was really sensitive, and there was a lot of very, very private things that occurred to her. There was abuse, there was rape, there was all kinds of tragedy in her life that led her to where she was. And so I gave her narrative when I contacted the U.S. attorney and I said, I'm representing this individual, I want to bring her in. We went in for what we call a proffer, and I gave him the narrative before we went in. I said, I want you to read this so you can understand where we are coming from. And she explained exactly how this whole thing happened, exactly what processes occurred, all of the steps that she took, what her father told her to do, and what she did as a result, so that the prosecutor, when we walked in for the proffer, already knew our side of the story. And then they were able to go in and ask her specific questions to kind of fill in the blanks. As we've discussed earlier, by the time you're under investigation, the feds already know almost everything about your case. They've read your bank records, they've spoken to witnesses. If they're going to charge a case, they're going to know everything there is to know about it. And so by the time we went in there, they had all that information, but they didn't know her side of it. And they were sympathetic. And they were able to see it from her perspective. She gave them spreadsheets. She gave them bank records. She said, these are the people who got refunds. And the government was really sympathetic. And because she was willing to tell them everything that she knew, including about her father, who is still in China, and her stepmother and her brother, which was extremely difficult for her, the government was really, really sympathetic to her situation.
And that's the reason that I was so, really adamant that she speak with Diane Bass, because there are too many attorneys who will take a different approach. And that approach really doesn't start with this premise of the government already has a tremendous amount of information. Otherwise, they never would have brought a criminal charge or an investigation in the first place. And if you don't work to mitigate, what generally happens, I've experienced, is prosecutors will dig their heels in and they will try to get a victory. And this is the equivalent for a biz dev person or a salesperson trying to get a big, sweet deal. The prosecutor is going to want to get a great conviction. And this is a $50 million fraud case. It's going to make headlines. It's going to get promotions. But with a great mitigation expert like Diane Bass, a person is able to really tell the story. And if you can tell the story well at the right time, you can start that mitigation process early. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned from some of your other clients who don't start that mitigation process early. What types of resistance do they get when it comes time to go for sentencing?
Well, they get the typical response, they're only admitting their guilt because they got caught. And where with this other client, she went in pre-indictment, and so they were sympathetic to that. There's a lot of catching up to do. If you wait until you're charged, you can't control what charges are going to be, what you're going to be indicted for. For instance, very frequently in fraud cases, there's an aggravated identity theft count, which is an additional 2 years, which is mandatory. The judge has to impose it, and it's consecutive to any other sentence. So I've been able to avoid the 1028A charges, which is the ID theft, because we've come in early, and that's kind of the bone that they throw us. But also, they're willing to work with us on variances and departures and things like that, like cooperation credit, which we actually did not get in that EB5 case. But we got a massive variance because of what she did and because of her history. So I think that what ends up happening, the other thing, of course, when people dig their heels in, is they end up getting arrested, where this client was able to walk into court with me and then walk out of court that same day with having agreed upon bond before we walked into court. So she did not see the inside of a jail cell.
And that's what's really important when you're facing a challenge with the federal government is we can use the term attorney, But what you really need is a counselor, somebody to help you understand the playing field and the options that you have. And certainly in some cases, it may make sense to go to trial. It may make sense to push the government to the test. But every day that a person digs his heels in, they're really exposing themselves to a more onerous sentence. And Diane is an expert at helping people convey that message and get sentences like 1 day for a $50 million fraud case. And I think what we should do is have another video where we speak about what is a variance, what is a cooperation agreement, what are additional steps that people can take to improve outcomes every step of the way. But if you're facing a challenge, my recommendation is you reach out to Diane Bass in Orange County, California, and you get some guidance on best possible options. Sadly, with a bigger government, we're going to see more government investigations. And the more we can do to help people understand that, the better off we're going to serve the people we want to serve. So could you stick around for another video?
Sure.